Love this podcast? Support it and sponsor today. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Wherever you may hail, I'm your host, John Bruni. Welcome to The Focus, where we bring you the most thought-provoking and informative current affairs analysis from around the world. Each episode, we invite top experts and analysts to share their insights on the most pressing issues of our time. From international relations and global economics to philosophy and science, no topic is off limits. Join us as we explore the complex and ever-changing landscape of the world, where we provide valuable perspectives on the events that shape our global community. Today, we are extremely pleased to be joined by a high-profile former U.S. Army officer who served as Commanding General, United States Army in Europe, Lieutenant General Ben Hodges. I'm pleased to say that General Hodges and I both belong to the Alphen Group, an initiative of a mutual friend and colleague of ours, Professor Julian Lindy French. The mission of the Alphen Group is to create solutions for a secure Europe. General Hodges has been front and center as one of the world's leading Ukraine war commentators since the events of February 2022. General Ben Hodges, thank you for joining us on The Focus.
Thank you very much for the privilege.
Sir, we recently had the pleasure of speaking with American scholar in international relations and mercenary forces, Dr. Sean McFate. In our discussion, we spoke about how countries seem to be wedded to old-style military thinking, that armies today seem to want a rerun of World War II, but with better weapons. Why do you think that President Putin departed from his infamous use of hybridized war that successfully and bloodlessly gave him Crimea in 2014?
I think two reasons. Number one, there obviously was a gross overconfidence inside the Kremlin on their own abilities, as well as on the lack of ability or will inside Ukraine. I think there was, because they had encountered so little difficulties back, not only with their invasion of Georgia, but also their invasion of Ukraine in 2014, that they felt pretty confident that they would be able just to roll into Ukraine. And they're on the inside of Ukraine. I mean, they had not done much since 2014 to increase ammunition stocks, capabilities. I mean, pretty much 8 years were wasted. So you can almost imagine that the Kremlin saying, okay, we'll just continue doing what we did in Crimea in 2014. The second reason, though, I think this entire war is what failed deterrence looks like, because the West had not reacted strongly and decisively after Georgia, after the Russians supported the Assad regime and jumped over President Obama's red line in Syria, about using chemical weapons, and because we really had done nothing after their invasion of Crimea in 2014. Germany was still building Nord Stream 2. Late into 2021, in the U.S., we were a total mess with our own domestic problems and chaos, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, the catastrophic end to Afghanistan. I think all of these things contributed to a perception in the Kremlin that the West could not and would not actually resist. So that's why I think this was failed deterrence by us, as well as inside Ukraine.
In your opinion, sir, are there too many vested interest groups on both sides of the Russia-Ukraine divide in keeping the war locked in a Clausewitzian struggle of big mobilized armies, armed with state-of-the-art but nonetheless traditional service-based weapons?
I hadn't thought about it like that, but you are correct that, we do have a tendency institutionally to try to stick with what, was in our DNA, our culture. Former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates a few years ago said that the United States has an absolutely perfect record of getting it wrong every single time when it comes to starting a war. How, we just don't know what we're getting into, or we underestimated what was happening. Eventually we'll get it right. And so the key is how fast can you get it right? And that remains to be seen here in Ukraine. But it really is about strategic understanding of the region. So much of the conversation about Ukraine seems to be as if it were an island instead of a really important part of the Black Sea region. I mean, the whole reason Catherine the Great annexed Crimea back at the end of the 18th century was because of it would give her and the Russian Empire the ability to influence everything around the Black Sea, to include, their arch rival, the Ottoman Empire, and everybody else in the region. So I think it's more complicated than just, large scale conventional warfare with modern weapons. It is a classic joint environment in my view. I mean, it is the Black Sea. You've got, fortunately, the Russians have not been able to pull together any sort of a joint operation. In fact, I don't think there's been a day certainly since February last year, where they have conducted what we would consider a joint operation. The Army, Navy, and Air Force acting independently of each other. John, I'm embarrassed how wrong I was about Russian capabilities. I mean, I was in a position where I was watching the Russians and I just overestimated what they would be able to do, because I had focused on modernization efforts and the fact that they had seemed to learn some lessons from their invasion of Georgia, which was not exactly a sparkling success, but they just eventually overwhelmed the Georgians. And I've tried to figure out how was I so wrong? And the first reason I was so wrong is because I failed to appreciate the impact and depth of corruption inside the Russian Ministry of Defense and in the services. I had always assumed there was a degree of corruption there, but I didn't appreciate the depth of it in terms of false reporting, poor quality control over equipment and supplies being delivered. And there's so many anecdotes that are out there that your listeners probably already know, but also the corrosive effect of what goes on inside organizations where corruption is rampant. Everybody knows that they have to pay their senior officer, or they have to pay whoever's inspecting things. And so there was a quality that was not there. And then the second thing that I failed to appreciate is actually only a very small part of the Russian military had true operational experience. I mean, it was against the law, Russian law, for conscripts, for example, to deploy outside of Russia before this. So the only part of the Russian military that had actually been doing anything were their professional, the airborne division, and some of those kind of forces. So most of the Russians who were involved in the large-scale invasion of Ukraine last year had never actually been on operation. And so that's when it shows up that you don't have non-commissioned officers and trained crews that know how to properly camouflage, maintain distance on convoys, properly manage the logistics. That only comes from experience, and here was my third error, really, really tough, demanding, realistic exercises where you train to the point of failure to identify what's wrong, what needs to be fixed. And what we know now, of course, most Russian exercises are big, giant demonstrations. They don't train to the point of failure. You would have to acknowledge that you made mistakes in order to fix it. But that doesn't happen in the Russian system. I mean, you don't get promoted if somebody makes mistakes. And so I missed the impact of those three things.
So does this also say something about strategic culture, but specifically the Western strategic culture? It's very hard to really penetrate, know the mind of an autocracy. I mean, we suffered a similar kind of fate with the long lost science of Sovietology. During the Cold War, we spent millions, trying to develop think tanks and various other means of garnering information from behind the Iron Curtain. And again, when you think of what's happened with the Russian situation, sometimes one gets to be so close to the enemy and you're watching for all sorts of signals, but the signals that ought to spring out at you aren't there because well, there's a lack of intelligence coming out of this opaque structure. You just really won't know until that structure's been tested, which then leads me to the next thing. And that is that we have this massive problem with China at the moment. So, I mean, from my perspective, and, having observed Australia's peculiarities with the People's Republic at the moment, one could say something similar, that China hasn't been tested in battle since 1979. How do we know that they're not going to be performing as badly as the Russians? They borrowed much of their technology and doctrine from the Soviet Union and from the Russian Federation. So it's not that much of a guess to suggest that maybe the Chinese would be in a spot of bother were they to try to cross the Taiwan Strait and invade Taiwan. I mean, that's just a conversation piece for you here, General.
Well, actually, I think that's a great point. Both of the main points that you just made. First, we did take our eye off of Russia for a couple of reasons. One, we naively thought they were going to be partners. I believed it. We had Russian soldiers with us when NATO's I-4, the implementation force, went into Bosnia in 1995. I mean, I was like, wow, this is really working. And I think we all wanted it to work, but we were naive about who and what Russia was, and that somehow capitalism and democracy would just take over and everything would be great. So we lost several years of people learning to speak Russian, studying the Kremlin, and today we don't have the same sort of visibility about who's who inside the Kremlin power circles that we did in the old days, where you could look up there on Red Square and you see the 6 or 7 old guys, and you kind of knew, who was in the process of dying, who was next, who had a mistress, all these kind of things. You sort of knew that. We don't have that anymore, and certainly in a country and a culture that is where there's no independent media, there's protesters or opposition are locked away. It's hard to know what's going on, which makes it a little bit of a challenge. It's hard to find somebody that could predict with confidence what Putin's next move might be, or how the Russian people react, who's in that circle around him. But I have thought about China. Are we making the same mistakes? We want to avoid making the same mistakes on assessing their capability that I did on assessing Russia. Surely there was corruption there, but I don't know the depth and how that might manifest itself. But that would be something to pay close attention to, whether it's false numbers, false reporting, about readiness levels, quality assurance. That first aspect. I always hear about the number of ships that the PLA Navy has and how many are being manufactured, but I very, very seldom see anything about a big Chinese Navy exercise where they go out there and train to the point of failure.
Yeah.
I mean, it's one thing to have an aircraft carrier, but to run a carrier strike group where you are constantly protecting the carrier itself against missiles, against submarines, against against all the myriad of threats that are out there. I have so much respect for my Navy friends that commanded a carrier strike group. When they would describe what they had to do, I thought, holy hell, I'm glad I went to the infantry. I would have never been able to do that. But that comes from, and you used the word culture. It's a culture inside the Navy about readiness, and how do you do that? I don't know that the Chinese Navy has that. They certainly don't have real operational experience, and it's a difference when you use your paramilitary fishing fleet to go in and smash up Filipino fishing vessels or Vietnamese fishing vessels. That's not the same thing as going up against the Royal Navy or the Australian Navy or the U.S. Navy.
Yeah, look, absolutely, and I also think that the way that the Chinese Navy has been structured is basically a tool of intimidation for the smaller countries around the South China Sea. I mean, most of the other countries of Southeast Asia would be quite intimidated by the presence or the potential presence of a large Chinese flotilla just bobbing up and down off their coastline. it may not freak us in Australia out as much, or certainly won't freak the Americans out. But in terms of just overall impact, it's going to impact on those that have the fewest capabilities to counter this sort of move. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's their force was built and designed to do what you just said, not to invade Taiwan. They could, but I mean, that the distances involved. When I look at, for example, Russia in the Black Sea, I had just assumed, because they had a large amphibious capability, I had assumed that once they did invade, that there would be amphibious operations going on up and down the Black Sea coast, all in the Azov coast. That would be ways to outmaneuver Ukrainian defenses and seize places like Odessa early on. But they never did do it, and I couldn't understand why. And so I started poking around, talking to Romanian intelligence officers, asking Ukrainians. And the fact is, the Russians had never really practiced to the detail that's required to carry off a very dangerous, very challenging amphibious operation. You know, the way our Marines do it in conjunction with other allies, it's a joint operation. The Russians had never practiced that. And so they were reluctant to ever try and do it unless they already had land forces controlling the ground. Well, what's the point? I mean, so fortunately, they didn't have the culture to do what was required to conduct a large amphibious operation. I have seen that the Chinese do demonstrations, and there is some degree of training there, obviously, but I just wonder how prepared they really are to go up against defenses that Taiwan would have, and presumably U.S. or other allies in the region that would be assisting in that defense.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. So returning back to the European front, what are your observations about how the Western powers have been supporting and advising Kiev in the defense of Ukraine so far?
Okay, so first, I think the Biden administration deserves huge credit for what it has done. The over $40 billion plus dollars of equipment, ammunition, different types of aid that has, and using all kinds of different methodologies to provide capability to Ukraine. And the fact that you've got 50 nations, plus or minus, that are sticking together after 18 months to do this. I am sure that nobody in the Kremlin ever dreamed that this would be the case, or that Germany would be a part of it this far into it, or that France would become increasingly muscular, and so on. So I think the president and his team deserve enormous credit for that. Having said that, they have failed at the critical task, which is to name or describe clearly what is our desired strategic outcome. What's the objective? What is the purpose for doing all this? Why can't they say, we want Ukraine to win? Why can't they say to everybody, including the American people, it is in our interest that Ukraine wins this war, that they eject Russia all the way back to the 1991 borders. It's in our interest, number one, because American prosperity depends on Europe's prosperity, and Europe's prosperity depends on stability, security, international organizations, and international law being respected, et cetera. So it's in our own interest that Europe is stable and secure. You don't have refugees all over the place. You have freedom of navigation and so on. Secondly, it's in our interest that the so-called international rules-based order, sovereignty, human rights, respect for international law, freedom of navigation, that these are respected, not only for business purposes, but because the Chinese are watching. I mean, these are all things that the Chinese are challenging. And so if we can't stick together in Europe to defend those, where it's much, much easier than it will be out in the Indo-Pacific region, then I don't think the Chinese are going to be terribly impressed with anything that we say or do. So the president has not done that. They say things like, we're with Ukraine for as long as it takes. And I would ask them, as long as what takes? I mean, that's not going to work. Voters are going to get tired after a while of saying, okay, why are we still doing this? And by the way, and all of your audience will be aware of this, of course. We spent 20 years in Afghanistan. Only in the first year do we have a clearly defined objective. The next 19 years, we never had a clearly defined objective. And so you end up spending $2 trillion and losing thousands of people. And then it ends in a catastrophe. There never was an objective. And you can't develop strategies or effective policy if you don't have a clearly defined objective. I think if the president were to say all of that, it's in our interest that Ukraine is successful, not because we love Ukrainians and we're inspired by them, which we are, but because it's in our strategic interest that they are successful here for all those reasons I just laid out. And therefore, because we want them to win, we're going to do everything required for them to win. So no more BS excuses about how much gas a M1 tank burns or how long it takes to train an F-16 pilot, or other false statements such as we don't have enough ATACMS to give. That's just not true. But these are all excuses because they don't want to or can't bring themselves to say, we want Ukraine to win. And because of that, the Germans are hiding behind the US. A big surprise to everybody in the Kremlin, as well as most of Europe, Germany is actually the number 2 or number 3 provider or contributor of aid, money, equipment to Ukraine, but they're holding back on providing the long-range precision strike capability that Ukraine really needs because they say, well, the US is not doing it. And I think this is all about political will.
Yeah, actually, I was going to say there's a sense of political timidity that runs through what we are about to do, what we're doing in terms of supporting Ukraine. But sir, would you say that the timidity probably comes from the fact that if Biden were to come out and say what you suggest he says, would that be considered by the Kremlin as a formal declaration of war?
Oh, look, the Kremlin is going to spin whatever we do and say any way they want to, anyhow. I was on an interview last night with Al Jazeera, and there was a Russian think tank or retired military guy that was on there as well. And, the topic was about the grain flow from Ukraine, and the U.S. There was some conversation that the U.S. might help somehow protect this humanitarian corridor to get grain from Odessa down through the straits and out to where it's supposed to go. And I've raised the question: what authority, what legal reason or standing does Russia have to? I mean, why do we even have a grain deal? So what? I mean, the Russians have no whatever. And then the Russian came on there and said, well, actually, Russia has every right to stop and inspect every ship moving through the Black Sea. Like, what? I mean, this is what you're dealing with. And so we should stop deterring ourselves just because we worry about what Russia might do. I mean, UK delivered Storm Shadow, French delivered Scout, crickets. Russians can't do anything. And so I think we are deterring ourselves out of partly to your earlier point, we don't have enough people that truly understand what's going on inside Russia and how people think anymore. And you've got a few people that were so-called Russia experts, that good people, smart, hardworking, I mean, super intelligent, but they mishandled Russia during the Obama administration. And now most of them are still in the Biden administration. And so, Russia is not something like a rheostat that if you just carefully turn the dial a little bit, you can influence how they do things. They only respond to brute force and the threat of brute force. That's the only thing they respect. And we need to quit being scared of our own shadow.
Crikey, you remind me of many conversations that I've had with my colleagues here in Adelaide about, what you ought to be doing when confronted by the bully in the schoolyard, by giving them a hall pass for bad behavior does nothing but encourage them to take another chunk out of you. And I think that we really do need to, draw that line very firmly. But getting back into Ukraine's fighting style, Ukraine's most stunning victories came about from an innovative use of light shoulder-mounted missiles and dogged guerrilla and dispersed small unit fighting. Why could such tactics not work during Ukraine's counteroffensive? I mean, why is Ukraine placing so much emphasis on achieving conventional force-on-force power when such a conventional war would favor the more numerous Russians?
Yeah. So good point. And of course, we're talking about a situation where when they were in defense, the Russians were in large part inept and vulnerable to exactly what you described. I mean, every single video that I saw of a Russian tank getting blown apart by some shoulder-fired weapon system, without fail, those tanks were out in the open, or they were clustered together, moving through a compact terrain like a forest or towns without being properly supported by infantry. This is all basic stuff. And so the Ukrainians were very good at in-law and javelin and other systems at making them pay a price. I mean, so they were in the defense in that particular circumstances. They were the ideal. Now, of course, we're in a different situation where even poorly trained Russian soldiers sitting in trenches behind minefields and dragon's teeth and tank ditches and all that sort of thing, backed up by lots of artillery. It's very, very difficult for Ukrainian forces to penetrate all that, especially when they do not have air support or air superiority. We would never send an Australian or British or American soldier into an attack in that situation without having already achieved total air superiority. So I think we're at about the 2-month mark on this Ukrainian counteroffensive. I think the Ukrainians have made the adaptations that they need to make. They realize, obviously, they can't just drive through these minefields, and they realize that the Russians have so much artillery, which is exactly what you're supposed to do, by the way. An obstacle that's not covered by direct or indirect fire is not an obstacle. So the Russians have done that properly. So it seems to me that Ukrainian General Staff has made the adjustment to say, okay, well, we're going to degrade artillery and logistics and transport to get it off our back so that we can then eventually clear some lanes through these minefields. And I think this is actually happening. And we should be providing more capability to help them knock out the Russian artillery, the Russian logistics, so that the counteroffensive can create these penetrations that they've got to create. The problem, of course, is that takes time. And you need longer range precision weapons to be able to do that. And we have been slow. We've been slow in providing capability, and we've been quick to criticize them for not being fast enough. And I would just say, many of your listeners will, of course, be aware of, the invasion of Normandy in June of 1944. After more than 2 years of training and lots of combat experience, the amphibious operation on the 6th of June, successful, got ashore. And then for the next 2 months, we were stuck. British, Canadian, and American forces were literally stuck in the bocage because the Germans had so skillfully turned the hedgerow country into a series of defensive lines. And we were not prepared for that. And so we had to use 2 months at the cost of thousands of young leaders, lieutenants and sergeants getting killed, until we figured out how to do it. And that was with overwhelming air superiority. And we finally achieved a breakout there in late August. So thank goodness these geniuses were not standing around Eisenhower tisk-tisking his poor performance as the commander of the Normandy invasion. So I think we should be a little bit more patient. The Ukrainian General Staff has impressed me from the beginning with their professionalism and also their discipline. We don't know a lot. We don't really know, and we're not entitled to know exactly what's going on the ground, status of forces, what they're doing. I think that's to their credit. And then finally, the purpose of this counteroffensive, I believe, is ultimately the liberation of Crimea. I mean, that's the decisive terrain. And so if we were to provide longer range precision strike capability, the Black Sea Fleet would already be gone. They couldn't sit in Sevastopol with a precision weapon hitting something in the harbor every day. They couldn't stay there. Same thing for the Air Force in Saki or their big logistics hub in Jankoy. They'd be gone. So but that's going to require policy change on our part.
Yeah, certainly. Many have said that Russia lost the war as soon as its tanks crossed the Ukrainian border, since it unified an apathetic and rudderless NATO. But NATO has still had its fair share of problems. I mean, military budgets are still low across NATO nations, particularly in Germany, begging the question that if Putin's forces were to march into Poland or Latvia, even in small feints rather than as a full-scale set of invasions, could NATO forces confront and defeat such threats? Have the problems that beset NATO in January 2022 been solved to your satisfaction?
So I think it's unfortunate when I hear people like even General Milley, who, our chairman, they talk about, well, Russia's already been defeated strategically. But what does that mean? I mean, that's a throwaway line in my view, because if Ukraine is not successful at winning and ejecting Russia from back to the 1991 borders, then can you really say that Russia was defeated strategically if they still sit in Crimea, for example, and they're still able to disrupt or interdict things happening in the Black Sea? I mean, I take the point, but I think that's not a useful statement. Having said that, what you say is correct in that the alliance has been jarred into action. Now, people like General Breedlove, Admiral Stavridis, General Scaparrotti, former SACEURs leading up to this February last year, and General Walters all had done a lot of work to help improve readiness in the alliance. But readiness ultimately is a political decision. The how to do it, that's the military responsibility, but the political will required to invest the money and to demand that military forces are ready to accomplish the task. That's about political will, to require your military to have a culture of readiness, and you're willing to spend what's necessary to do proper maintenance, to do modernization, to invest money in training exercises. That's about political will. And so it took the jarring experience of Russia's invasion, large-scale invasion, February last year, for our civilian leadership to say, "Holy shit, this is for real." Now, obviously, the civilian leadership in from Finland on down, or especially Estonia down through Romania, this was not a shock to them. They have been saying this for years. Like, hey, we know these guys. We used to be under their thumb. This is what they're going to do. But everybody to the west of, they're like, oh, come on, you guys are, you don't get it. You're scaremongering. But I mean, the invasion in 2014 was not enough to really jar us. Now, the alliance did start doing certain things. The decision to deploy enhanced forward presence battle groups, for example, that was a big deal. Or the decision by the United States to start bringing tanks back into Europe, again, even on a rotational basis, that was a big deal. And I would say that the current SACEUR, General Cavoli, has done a terrific job earning the confidence of the nations, so that finally here at the Vilnius summit, he got approval of plans for the defense of Eastern Europe. This may be a shock to many people, but we did not have approved plans for how to do this, because you can't, inside NATO, you can't actually do formal planning without a directive from the civilian leadership, from the North Atlantic Council, the 31 nations. And so now that you've got that, you can have plans, and requirements come from plans, and then you can allocate resources to carry out those requirements and tasks. You can build exercises that are tied to plans. This is a big deal, and this will do a lot over the coming years to improve our readiness capabilities. But there are a couple of areas where we still are, where I'm absolutely not satisfied. I know SACEUR is not satisfied. The first is integrated air and missile defense. We are so far behind in our ability to protect not only critical infrastructure, but 500 million European citizens. I mean, I think it was a surprise to most of us that the Russians would use multi-million-dollar precision weapons against apartment buildings and schools and shopping centers. I was like, wow, that changes the requirement for air and missile defense. It's not just about protecting airports and seaports and railroads. It's about a much larger requirement, and we are not prepared for that. I think we're in deep trouble if we don't address that in terms of capability and training. The ammunition I think is well documented by now. Everybody's alive to the fact that we don't have enough ammunition. And so I talked to somebody the other night. They said the price of a one round of 155 millimeter ammunition is up to around $3,000 now for one round of our. This is supply and demand, and the critical part of the supply chain is the explosive. Everybody's competing over the same source of explosive. So this is, but we're having to play catch up.
It's really interesting you say that, because again, I would be a little bit critical about the way that we tend to think when we see a problem, especially in the military, the modern military now. It's usually hit by neoliberal economic theory, and I'm particularly critical about just-in-time. Now, I know that just-in-time, in a time of relative peace, can deliver a lot of good to the nation in terms of saved costs. But really, war is about stockpiling. It's about warehousing. It's about distribution on time. It's not about just-in-time. Just-in-time's okay when you're trading civilian products around the place. But what has happened, as far as my observations are concerned, that over the last 25 years, the militaries have been following our society generally into the neoliberal economic order. And so therefore we run our militaries accordingly. And therefore, when, Ukraine happened, we all, basically went into the war with our pants around our knees, thinking, by God, we need more. Where's the ammunition? Where are the weapons platforms? If this goes really badly for us, how do we fight this war? Sticks and stones? I don't know.
So you are exactly right. There is a desire, and this was borne out during COVID also, when you discover that you don't have adequate stocks of masks or devices and basic things, because people are rewarded for efficiency. And if you're not running a business, but you're trying to do something, whether it's healthcare or life-saving or defense, you're dealing with the unknown and the uncertainty, which is the nature of war. And so you have to have some depth, the ability to absorb bad decisions, losses, surprised by the enemy, all the friction that happens out there. You have to have some depth. And it's just hard to explain that to members of Congress, for example, on why you need tens of thousands of rounds of ammunition that you hope you'll never have to use. Or that you kind of cycle through. It's like, what? When I hear good people say, well, you could never run if you ran the country like a business, we wouldn't have so much waste. Okay, well, the country is not a business. It's when your primary responsibility is the defense of the nation, you've got to make sure you can defend the nation. And right now I live here in Frankfurt, Germany, and the Germans had humiliating embarrassment 2 days ago that the foreign minister, she was on her way to Australia on a German Air Force, or the official government airplane, and it broke down twice, and the trip was canceled. And the same thing happened to Chancellor Merkel, Chancellor Scholz, Defense Minister von der Leyen, and Foreign Minister Musk over the last few years. This is the government plane for the top officials of Germany, and it's because they have not put a premium on readiness and having enough aircraft to be able to do the task. And so when you look at the German Bundeswehr, the German leadership, the military, they didn't forget how to do maintenance on tanks or submarines. They know how to do it. But because the political leadership was so convinced that, come on, we don't need all this shit anymore, and Russia's going to be our partner. So the readiness went down, and you don't have enough ammunition. You've got more vehicles sitting in maintenance than you do that are operational. This is Germany. I mean, the iconic engineering capital of the universe. What happened? And it's about political will.
It's amazing. I'm reminded of the long-standing argument between efficiency and effectiveness. I mean, you can be highly efficient, but you can be extremely ineffective. And I think that the way that the West has been planning its defenses generally over the last generation, we've gotten the efficiencies, we've lost the effectiveness, and now we're really stuck in trying to work out ways in which we can de-efficientize our systems and make them effective. It's going to be hard work. And I think that the politicians who have basically been brought up in this system, it's going to be very difficult for them to. It'll almost be like, what do they call it? Cognitive dissonance. It's like, oh, no, we still have to make savings. I mean, I see here in Australia, for instance, with the whole AUKUS thing, when we talk about the numbers publicly of how much this is going to cost Australia, you've got the bean counters in Canberra jumping up and down. You've got the usual groups flying their banners and saying, oh, no, we can't do this and we've got to cut costs. Well, you can't cut costs in something as fundamental as national defense. You either have national defense and you commit to it, or you do not. And if you do not, then be prepared to suffer the consequences in the future.
Well, our friend Julian, he uses the phrase, do you want to have the amount of defense you can afford or the amount of defense that you need? And I think that's the right question. Now our political leadership or the taxpayer should demand, of course, that we don't waste money, that we are smart in how we use the funds. So that's different from just emphasizing efficiency at the cost of effectiveness. But certainly we have mismanaged weapons development programs in the Army. There you can always find excess and waste. There's no doubt about that. But this is where the Congress, should hold us accountable through the oversight committees, which they do, and then we should pay a price for that. But still, the expectation that, an example, for years the United States has had a series of arsenals and depots, a defense industry that belongs to the state that was kept alive in case we had to mobilize. Most of our stuff, of course, is done by commercial industry, the big names that you'll all recognize, and you'll have some of that in Australia as well. But we also have, the Watervliet Arsenal in New York. That's where they make the tube for howitzers. Right. There's one of them. The tank plant in Lima, Ohio, where the M1 tank is manufactured, or we've got 2 or 3 ammunition plants. They're owned by the state, but they're operated by companies, commercial companies. And so you had members of Congress that represented these states and districts, and they always made sure that these things were kept alive so that we would have the ability, if we had to expand, which we're doing right now, you had something from which to start. And so inside of a year, artillery ammunition production increased in the United States from 8,000 rounds a month, which is what we needed to maintain our training stocks. They're up over 25,000 rounds now. And that was all that took was the State Department of Defense say, okay, here's the money to increase production. They had the facility. They just needed to add another shift or another line. So having some depth to be able to expand, that's not efficient, but obviously it's essential.
Yes, absolutely. So if we go back to our dear friends in the Kremlin, there's been so much speculation following on from the Prigozhin march to Moscow. But General, what was it? I mean, did Putin and Prigozhin stage the whole thing? Does Prigozhin actually want to seize power in Moscow? Sean McFake told us that the march to Moscow by the Wagner Group was simply a dispute between a mercenary outfit seeking better terms of engagement from its employer. I mean, this sounds a far less conspiratorial thing. Indeed, it sounds almost mundane, and therefore it could be true. But how do you see the Wagner Group's mutiny, and what lasting impact do you think it's had on Russia's conventional fighting capacity in Ukraine?
So I think Sean is exactly right that this, and I'm glad you used the word mutiny, not coup. A coup is an attempted overthrow of the government. I don't think Prigozhin had any plans or any desire to do that. This was a business move on his part. He is, at the end of the day, a businessman, not some Russian patriot. And he saw that Shoigu was making a move to get control of all mercenary operations. And there was no way he was going to stand for the guy he hates most on the planet to get control over Wagner. And so this mutiny, and mutiny through history has generally been staged by sailors or soldiers who were extremely unhappy with the conditions or terms of their employment, whether it was treatment, pay, abuse, whatever. And so I think this whole march was revealing in that it clearly, I mean, when I heard, okay, there's 400 vehicles, like, Okay, how do we know there's 400? But anyway, they're moving basically unopposed from Rostov towards Moscow. That revealed how weak and disorganized Russia really was. I don't believe this whole thing was worked up. I mean, that would be quite an accomplishment to get enough people involved to go along with this. Although there was clearly some inside thing happening in Rostov that they could take over the headquarters, unopposed.
Yeah.
But then people in Moscow start panicking and tearing up roads and, parking dump trucks on the highway and all that. What, 400 vehicles? Let's assume there were 400 vehicles. In any large metropolitan area, 400 vehicles disappear in rush hour traffic. I mean, what were they going to do? So I thought, okay, this is clearly not a coup unless he really thought he had it stitched up that the military or the police were going to rise up and come out in the streets, which clearly did not happen. What was noticeable to me was, number one, there were no Russian people out in the streets defending their great leader, protesting against this. Nobody. When there were some people in Rostov that cheered for Prigozhin's guys, but there was nobody in the street the way they did in Turkey when the attempted coup took place a few years ago, where thousands of Turks came out in the street to defend the government. Zero of that. And then the absence of almost any official, big names to come out and say, stop. I mean, so now Putin's got to be wondering, who can he count on? I mean, a lot of people are probably staying away from windows these days. Now, why is Prigozhin still alive and why is he still in business? I think because, number one, Wagner generates a lot of income for people in the Kremlin. I think the operations in Africa, that's still going on, and it's a useful tool for the Kremlin as well. And so he's still alive for that. And he got what he wanted. Not only is his company not under control of MOD, he got his guys out of the meat grinder in Ukraine. So he's not losing hundreds of people every day either. I can't imagine that they're actually really going to do anything from Belarus. I think this is all distraction to force Ukraine and us to have to think about Belarus and Ukraine's northern border, Poland and Lithuania. Are talking about closing their border with Belarus now. The Poles have deployed troops to the border. So that's a distraction, but I don't see anything else.
General Hodges, do you think that the Western powers and their Eastern rivals, the Russian Federation and China, fetishize military technology? Most of the headline stories capturing the public's attention about the Russia-Ukraine war is about who has what piece of kit in inventory, how many of them, and how reliable they are. But as you and I both know, war is about people. It's about culture and politics and what motivates people to keep fighting when all hope is lost. This is the actual stuff that wins or loses wars, and arguably always has. Why does our modern military discourse tend to de-emphasize this aspect of warfare?
It's an excellent question. I think in the West, we have a belief in the superiority of technology, that you can somehow accomplish military tasks with precision and without great expenditure of lives. So I mean, it's not an evil thing. It's about trying to do it without losing people. That's why every president loves having being able to do long-range drone strikes or cruise missiles, or so they can not worry so much about guys getting killed or captured, shot down, that sort of thing. I think that's part of it. And the American way of war that really came to being in World War II was, if you can use artillery instead of infantry to accomplish the task. I talked to a World War II veteran who eventually became a 4-star in the U.S. Army, General Depew, and he said the job of infantry battalions in World War II was to move forward observers across the country so that they could, keep shooting artillery.
Yep.
But I think we know from history that war is a test of will as much as it is a test of logistics. And the will, there's so many examples in history of soldiers that had superior will, even though they were outnumbered or did not have the latest technology. I was on a Twitter space call last night, and a Ukrainian soldier called in, and he made the comment. He said just the other day, he and his squad with 2 $300 drones had destroyed a Russian T-90 tank, their latest tank. And he said the way they did it, the first drone, he was obviously very proud of this return on investment because he kept emphasizing the cost of the two drones and the cost of a T-90 tank was that the first drone was able to deliver a strike that caused the tank to stop. It damaged it enough. And then the crew, of course, immediately pops open the hatch. And then the second drone drops in a grenade into the tank. Boom. Yep. And so, you've got this asymmetric approach with clever soldiers, innovative soldiers against high technology. Of course, the wrong lesson to learn, in my view, would be, okay, well, tanks obviously no longer have a place on the battlefield. That's not the right lesson. Tanks that are poorly employed with untrained crews that are not disciplined, those definitely are going to go the way of the buffalo. So, but this was a case of determined soldiers using innovative ways to destroy a superior technology.
No talking about the Russia-Ukraine war can avoid the 64,000-pound elephant in the room, nuclear weapons, and Putin's repeated nuclear saber rattling since the war started. But as we approach the last quarter of 2023, there seems less and less likelihood of any sort of actual nuclear attack on Ukraine, either as a demonstration or as an actual strike against a target. What is your take on nuclear weapons today, especially in high-stakes conventional warfare, where one side has them and the other does not? Are nuclear weapons losing their luster as instruments of strategic intimidation?
I would say that they have not lost their luster because they have been very effective against the United States. The threat of the use of a tactical nuclear weapon has caused us to self-deter. I think that's the number one factor why the Biden administration has not said, we want Ukraine to win, because the president always talks about no World War III, no escalation. And so everything we do, I mean, you may recall back in the beginning when the decision to provide Stinger to Ukraine was being considered. Stinger now, there were people that were wringing their hands about, oh my God, what happens if a Ukrainian soldier uses an American-made Stinger to shoot down a Russian helicopter? They might escalate. I mean, how ridiculous is that? But that was the thinking. And so over the last 18 months, we've had this painful, grinding incremental decision process about each, we'll never do tanks. We did tanks. We'll never do Patriot. We did Patriot. We'll never do, and here we are. But yet we stopped short of providing the long-range precision capability that would make Crimea untenable, because of concern that the Ukrainians might use it against targets inside Russia, thus leading to escalation. So I think the Russians realize that their nuclear weapons are most effective for them when they don't use them, because they get this deterrence effect. There are zero outcomes. I think they know there actually are zero positive outcomes for Russia if they use a nuclear weapon. There's nothing good that will come of it. The Chinese have told them, don't do it. And I think that has an impact. My president has said there will be catastrophic consequences for Russia if they use a nuclear weapon. The Ukrainians have said, we're not going to stop if they use a nuclear weapon. I mean, and then there's a misunderstanding about nuclear weapons. Tactical nuclear weapons, depending on the type it is, they don't necessarily have this Chernobyl-like or Hiroshima-like radioactivity, the destructive power. We have overstated the likelihood, and we have exaggerated the potential implications if they do use it, to the point that now we assume that they would do it, therefore we stop. I think the reason that we haven't said, yes, we want Ukraine to get Crimea, is because people assume, well, that's Putin's red line and he'll go nuclear. I mean, that's not very sophisticated strategic thinking, but that's what's driving policy, unfortunately.
Yeah, and the whole notion of, the Ukrainians will use them against Russia. Well, that cat's been out of the bag for quite some time. The Ukrainians, using far lesser technologies, have been attacking rear echelon formations in Western Russia, and as well as actually attacking Moscow itself. So really, I mean, they are attacking Russia, and rightfully so, because they have sustained an extraordinary amount of punishment on their own urban infrastructure. I mean, civilians have been constantly targeted in this war. So the Russians haven't been pulling back in that sense. Anyway. I'm John Bruni, and you're listening to Sage International's The Focus podcast. And from Frankfurt, Germany, we're speaking with international commentator on the Russia-Ukraine war and former commanding general of the United States Army in Europe, Lieutenant General Ben Hodges. General Hodges, Elon Musk and his Starlink satellite network have been getting a lot of negative publicity lately. If ever there was a disruptive influence on this otherwise quite traditional conventional war, it is that of an American mogul not being totally aligned with his government's strategic objectives. How disruptive is Musk's on-again, off-again support for Ukraine's defense? What can the Biden administration do to elicit a less mercurial response from Musk, or is this something only market forces can achieve?
Well, this is a very concerning development where one person that has such enormous wealth can influence the battlefield like this. Now, I mean, industry has always played a role because it produces the weapons and capabilities and helps mobilize nations. So that's industry itself is obviously not the problem. But in this case, where you've got one guy that has the ability to provide a capability that is so important, and his policy, his political leanings, his strategic view of things are not necessarily in line with ours. This is a problem. And so part of it, of course, the administration should be, and I imagine is, talking to him about curbing his unpredictability or his unwillingness to support U.S. objectives. And in the meanwhile, hopefully we are looking for other competitors that can provide a capability. And there are some others that are emerging out there that can provide the sort of capability that Mr. Musk has provided. But this is a problem. It's a unique situation that probably has happened somewhere in the past, but I'm not familiar with it.
The Russian economy has been put under severe pressure by the weight of Western sanctions. But this hasn't brought Russian military industries to their knees yet. Putin is essentially friendless internationally, except for a cool and cautious China and some big-talking anti-Western champions in Africa, Latin America, and of course, Iran and North Korea. However, none are capable of furnishing nor willing to furnish Russia with the men and material necessary to help crush Ukrainian resistance. China's ability to provide Russia advanced semiconductors has been clipped by the Biden administration's CHIP Act. Iran can provide drones, but there'll be a limit to how much of this technology the Ayatollahs are willing to sell, considering the tensions are again rising up between themselves and Israel and the United States. So is Russia now closer to culmination because of these things, or can it plow through the difficulties in typical Russian fashion?
I think this is one of the most important questions you've brought up, John. And I'm not an economist, so I wouldn't claim to fully understand the impact of sanctions and Russian capacity. But I agree with all the different aspects you just highlighted about who is helping, their ability to help, and so on. I read as much as I can to try and understand what's going on inside of Russia's defense industry. I do believe that it is in tatters, that the sanctions clearly are having an impact because so much of what they used to use to make precision weapons, for example, came from Western countries. That's gone. So they're having to substitute with ersatz electronic components that are not the same quality, and so that affects the quality, the precision, for example, of certain weapons. And I think there are analysts out there who have been looking at this, and they see a rising failure rate, for example, of different types of Russian munitions. Still, they can make a lot, but nonetheless, there is an impact there. I read the other day, President Putin was complaining or bemoaning the fact that they did not have enough people to work in all their defense industry, the factories. No kidding, because they're all being drafted and mobilized and getting killed in Ukraine. So they've got a manpower problem that's part of their industry challenge as well. And then you've got, I mean, this is still Russia. So you've got theft, corruption, sabotage, shoddy materials. That's a part of it. And then finally, I don't believe any number that comes out of there. I read this morning where there was a big defense industry show outside Moscow the other day, and Putin or Medvedev, somebody said, we've quadrupled tank production since the beginning of the war. What a load of shit. I mean, that's just impossible. But that's what they say. And I seriously doubt that they have quadrupled. Maybe what they have done is pulled out 4 times as many used tanks from the 50s and 60s and trying to buff them up. Maybe that's what they're talking about. But
good old T-55.
Yeah,
that'll do the job.
Older than me. So
anyway, there's been a lot of controversy, General, about the US decision to send cluster bombs to Ukraine, which Ukrainian forces have already successfully deployed against Russian positions. But the Russians have been using cluster munitions since the beginning of the war. So why is it that when Russia uses terrible weapons such as thermobaric or cluster bombs, the world remains silent? But when the US decides to up the ante by providing these weapons to Ukraine, shrill media headlines follow in the decision's wake.
Well, I think this is the result of 2 or 3 things. First, Russia has been getting a pass on, or we've all become numb to it, maybe. That's what it is. Well, of course the Russians are killing civilians. Of course the Russians are using those weapons. Oh, that's what they do. And it's somehow, it's acceptable. And then Lavrov, before February last year, is still welcomed and greeted, and he's able to go to all the nice champagne receptions, and he's treated like some kind of real diplomat. He's a thug just like the rest of them. He looks and acts less thug-like than the rest of them. So we have allowed ourselves to become numb, because there were an awful lot of people, to include in the United States, that were making a ton of money off of business relationships. I think that's a part of it. Second, we lack confidence to get out there and explain, hey, look, this is why we're doing this. Here's our objective. Our objective is to help Ukraine win. We're going to do everything it takes. And right now, we don't have enough artillery ammunition to give them. So until production can catch up, we're going to pull these 2 or 3 million rounds of DPICM that we have, that we were going to destroy anyway, and we're going to give those to the Ukrainians, because them winning. And by the way, the dud rate or the failure rate of a US DPICM is between 1% and 2%, compared to the 25% and 30% failure rate of a Russian DPICM. And we're making a decision and own it. I mean, we're going to do it, and here's why we're doing it. Explain all that. And then, of course, you'll always have some people bemoaning this decision. I personally am a little bit conflicted with it, because I do, I'm affiliated with Human Rights First. I'm affiliated with the Halo Foundation that does demining. And these are good people that are concerned about, you have bomblets on the ground in places. But in this case, these are Ukrainian soldiers employing this weapon inside Ukraine against an invader. So they know where they're shooting. And they're not shooting them in downtown, they're shooting them in fields against trench lines. So I think the reaction by the opponents of DPICM was overly hysteric, and it's pretty much gone now anyway.
Okay, final question, General Hodges. Many have criticized Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky's decision to focus so much of Ukraine's military efforts around the town of Bakhmut. As we've already established, attrition warfare favors the larger party, not the smaller one. Was this a strategic error on behalf of Ukrainian High Command?
I have thought about this a good bit. I don't think it was a mistake. Number one, it bled the Russians a lot. The fact that the Russians, particularly Prigozhin, was so focused on Bakhmut always struck me as unusual. And so I thought there had to be a business reason associated with it, whether it was the gypsum mines and other materials that are in the area. I mean, that's kind of the Wagner model. I could almost imagine the Kremlin saying, hey man, if you capture it, you get to keep it. So that was part of it. But it also looked to me that it bought some time for the Ukrainians. I mean, they weren't sending their new armored brigades up there. They were using a lot of the troops that were in and around Bakhmut were Territorial Defense Force. Still paid a huge price, but they were able to keep out their newer brigades that they're training and preparing for the counteroffensive, keep them out of there. Ultimately, I mean, we'll probably learn more when this is all over, some of the thinking, the decision making about the analysis that was done. But in this case, I would think that I'm sympathetic to the decision by the Ukrainian government and the general staff to do what they did and how they did it.
General Hodges, thank you for joining us today and for sharing your insights on the focus. It's been an absolute honor.
I really enjoyed the conversation, John, and I look forward to seeing you again.
And to our audience, thanks for tuning into the Focus podcast. We hope that you found today's discussion enlightening and thought-provoking. If you have any comments or questions, please feel free to reach out to us on social media. You can find the Focus on Facebook, referenced on the John Bruni and Sage International LinkedIn pages, and on Twitter or on the Sage International website, sageinternational.com.au, by clicking the media drop-down menu and hitting podcasts. And please leave us your comments on inquiries@sageinternational.com.au. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and or leave us a review on your favorite platform. My thanks to our stalwart production team of Malcolm Hughes and Neil Smart, and to the team at the Ozcast Network. Join us again next time as we continue to delve into the most pressing current affairs issues of our time. Until then, stay informed and stay engaged. I'm John Bruni, and from Adelaide, South Australia, you've been listening to The Focus.
Love this podcast? Support it and sponsor today. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.